when I attempt to present it in the U.S., especially to our government, whether it's the Congress or the White House, basically there's no interest. I mean, the response is something like, "You got to be kidding! We are not interested in a bureaucracy. We know what the problem is, and we want the Chinese to be more responsive to our perspective." I definitely feel that we play just as an important a role in China in leading to this dysfunctional relationship, and it's our obligation to really commit to a different approach to managing the relationship. And if you don't like the secretary, give me a better idea. I'm happy to listen to it.
Imagine spending an hour with the world's greatest traders. Imagine learning from their experiences, their successes, and their failures. Imagine no more. Welcome to Top Traders Unplugged, the place where you can learn from the best hedge fund managers in the world so you can take your manager due diligence or investment career to the next level. Before we begin today's conversation, remember to keep two things in mind. All the discussion we will have about investment performance is about the past, and past performance does not guarantee or even infer anything about future performance. Also understand that there's a significant risk of financial loss with all investment strategies, and you need to request and understand the specific risks from the investment manager about their product before you make investment decisions. Here's your host, veteran hedge fund manager, Niels Larsen.
For me, the best part of my podcasting journey has been the opportunity to speak to a huge range of extraordinary people from all around the world. In this series, I have invited one of them, namely Kevin Coldiron, to host a series of in-depth conversations to help uncover and explain new ideas to make you a better investor. In the series, Kevin will be speaking to authors of new books and research papers to better understand the global economy and the dynamics that shape it, so that we can all successfully navigate the challenges within it. And with that, please welcome Kevin Coldiron.
All right. Thanks, Niels, and welcome, everyone. So Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, who initiated the modern relationship between China and the U.S. in the early 1970s, now says the two countries are at the foothills of a new Cold War. And as we follow the news every day, it really does feel like we're climbing higher and higher in those hills. But today we're going to talk about how and why the two countries got to that point, and more importantly, outline a path for walking back down, away from conflict toward a more stable, interdependent relationship. And the guest who's going to take us through that path is Stephen Roach. His commentary and analysis have helped shape policy debates in both Beijing and Washington for many years. He spent 30 years at Morgan Stanley, where he was the chief economist, and for those of us in the markets, a must-read about Asia. He then went on to become the chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and since 2010 has been at Yale, where he's currently a senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center. He's written 3 books all about Asia, and he's here to talk about his most recent one called Accidental Conflict, America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives. So Stephen Roach, it's a real honor to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us, and welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, Kevin.
So at the end of your book, you describe yourself as a recovering Wall Street forecaster. So it's been over a decade. Are you fully recovered now?
Well, I don't think anyone ever fully recovers from anything, but the Wall Street experience was challenging. It was enriching. It gave me the opportunity to travel and see many important countries, their policymakers, get familiar with their institutions. So I wouldn't give that up for anything, but I'm glad to be out of that and now taking a more academic perspective on many of the issues that whetted my curiosity, but I could only touch briefly when I was in the Wall Street world.
The title of your book, says that the story really is about narratives, and I thought maybe we could start with a little bit of your own personal story. You visited China many, many times. You've spoken at conferences. You've talked with policymakers. Can you walk us through a little bit of your own kind of personal history with the country?
Sure. I first went to China in the early 1990s, but these were infrequent and brief, sporadic trips. My appetite was whetted, though, in the late 1990s in the depths of the Asian financial crisis when I was heading up Morgan Stanley's highly regarded global economics team, who basically didn't have a clue as to how the Asian crisis was unfolding. And so I had a hunch, only a hunch, that China would hold the key to the end game of what many were calling, the first crisis of modern globalization. So I started going there in late 97 quite frequently, in fact, every other month. And, it just took off. It quickly became evident to me that China was not going to go the way of, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and others that were falling like dominoes, that had the wherewithal, the strategy, and most of all, the determination to avoid currency devaluations and resist the capital flight that was taking down other countries. And I started writing about it, and my research was picked up by some senior Chinese policymakers. I was invited to a number of important international conferences in China, became a trusted confidant of the Chinese leadership for reasons that still escape me. But in any case, really had tremendous access and still do. I was just in China last week for the first time since COVID. And while China is very different than it was 25 years ago in the depths of the Asian crisis, it's still a fascinating place to go.
The arguments in the book hinge on, the distinction between true and false narratives. And, you say right now the two countries are trapped in kind of dueling false narratives about each other. And I want to talk about, I'm going to spend most of the time kind of outlining those narratives. But before we get to that, there's a fascinating little bit in the book where you kind of introduce this concept, and you talk about why false narratives are so prevalent just in human society. And you kind of reference this MIT study that compared kind of how both true and false stories spread. And I was wondering maybe if you could just kind of summarize that for us, because it seems like pretty important for us to just appreciate why false rumors play such an important role in kind of relationships.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I think that's such an important point to really unpack the key points I'm trying to make in this book. My view that I try to develop and defend is that these false narratives don't just arise in a vacuum of nations and their leaders trying to fabricate stories about adversaries, but they really stem from a deep-seated vulnerability that each nation is unwilling to accept. And in the case of the U.S., we're not. We're certainly a superpower, global hegemon, but our economic foundations are not as strong as we'd like to believe. And I go through that in the book. Our political stability is being drawn into question daily, and especially today on the day of the indictment of a former president. And our social stability reflects a worrisome and potentially dangerous polarization. So we're vulnerable, and we don't want to face up to it. And the way our political system works is when you don't want to face up to your own vulnerabilities, you tend to blame someone else outside of your system for that. And China's our big adversary. China's our biggest trading partner. China's the holds the biggest questions with respect to our own economic prosperity. China's clearly flirted with some transgressions in the areas of technology, trade secrets, human rights that make us very uncomfortable. And so China is our favorite scapegoat. But, and I would just add, this is not a dissimilar sort of blame game from that which we relied on 30 years ago when we blamed Japan for many of our, at least economic problems at the time. So, we're good at blame. The Chinese suffer from a similar affliction. They, are sort of celebrating their strength, the rejuvenation in Xi Jinping's terms, their aspirations to become a great modern socialist nation by 2049, which would be the 100th year of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And for Xi Jinping, the promise that he has made to the Chinese people and to the party really hinges on being able to deliver a growth and development trajectory that justifies those claims of rejuvenation and great power status. Yet the Chinese economy is surprisingly vulnerable as well. It's unbalanced, in the words of a former premier now nearly, 15 years ago, Wen Jiabao, who claimed that the Chinese economy correctly was unbalanced, unstable, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And China has yet to fully address those concerns. So a vulnerable China turns out to blame an adversary that it now views, in Xi Jinping's words just a few weeks ago to the National People's Congress, as a United States that is intent on suppression, containment, and all-around encirclement of China's system, to say nothing of its development objectives. So the blame is two-way, and I developed that in going through the false narratives that in most cases are fact-based, but they draw the wrong conclusions on both sides of this conflict.
Let's talk about that. The false narratives. Go into maybe a little bit more detail so we can kind of get some kind of more granular context on how we reach this point. So, from the U.S. perspective, you talk about a couple false narratives. The first one is what you call the bilateral blunder, which is essentially, just looking at the U.S. Trade performance on a U.S.-China basis and not looking at it on a more multilateral basis, getting a more kind of complete picture of what's going on. Can you explain what you mean by that in a little more detail?
Yeah, if you had to ask me for my favorite false narrative on the U.S. side, that would be it. I actually, the chapter that goes through it is called bilateral bluster, but blunder is fine. They sort of mean the same thing. And what I argue in that chapter is, yes, America has a large trade deficit that inflicts hardship and pain on American workers, their companies, and the communities in which they reside. But this deficit is very much an outgrowth of a shortfall in domestic saving. When countries have low saving rates and they want to grow, they have to import surplus savings from abroad and run massive balance of payments deficits with the world. And those balance of payments deficits give rise to multilateral trade deficits with many countries. In 2022, for example, the United States had trade deficits with 106 countries. Yes, China is the largest piece of our 106 country multilateral trade deficit, but that still leaves 105 others by hardly unsophisticated math. And if you put tariffs on China, as the Trump administration did, and as the Biden administration continues to levy, all you do, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You shrink the Chinese piece of our multilateral trade deficit, but that gets diverted because our savings is still under pressure to other countries. And that's exactly what's happened over the last several years. The Chinese piece has come down, but our trade deficits with countries like, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Japan, Germany, Mexico, Canada have all increased, and our overall trade deficit has gotten larger. In fact, hit a new record last year. And so the false narrative that I stress in this chapter is that, yes, America has a big trade deficit, but we cannot pin it on China. It reflects largely our shortfall of domestic saving, which is pretty much an own goal in the realm of economic reality.
You also make the point later in the book that while the savings narrative is, the false narrative, I guess the savings narrative is true. The U.S. has a savings deficit. Blaming it on on China is the false narrative. That's also going to be a challenging one to kind of promote politically, and we can talk about some of the ways you move around that. You also, that's a clear false narrative that you talk about. You have some other ones that are interesting. One is this notion that, well, yeah, we're in a Cold War with China, but we can win it. We already won one, and that over the long term, our economic strength, our open democracy is going to win out. And you're skeptical of that argument, and you're saying, yeah, you did win the first Cold War, but you were in a much stronger position economically going into it, and the system that you were, if you will, facing off against was very different economically, far less sustainable than what you have in China. So, can you elaborate a little bit on that, on why you worry that that's a kind of a dangerous narrative?
Well, it's very important. I mean, you started out in introducing our talk today with the Henry Kissinger quote of that we're in the foothills of a new Cold War. He actually said that. He did say that, but he said it now nearly 4 years ago. I think it was in 2019. He would be the first to admit that we've climbed well above the foothills. In fact, this is a legitimate Cold War. It's a different Cold War. There are no two are alike. We've only had two of them, so it's difficult to sort of make the same precise comparisons. But the one I make in the book is that the first Cold War against the former Soviet Union occurred in a period of great economic prosperity in the United States. We were sort of in the sweet spot of our post-World War II revival during this 1947 to 1991 period when we fought and ultimately defeated the former Soviet Union. And the comparison that I make this time is that our economy is a good deal weaker. It's true if you look at the numbers on GDP growth, productivity growth, domestic saving, which is a key aspect of the comparative metrics I use, the trade deficit, the balance of payments deficit. And I document this in the book. We're basically running at a sharply reduced pace in terms of productivity and GDP compared to that earlier period. And our imbalances in terms of savings and trade in the current account are far more severe. But the adversary is different. The Soviet Union was a small economy. It was a peer competitor in terms of weapons technology, but it was a very, very small economy compared to the behemoth that we now encounter in China. And at the end of the first Cold War, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And so many Cold War scholars conclude correctly, in my view, that the decisive battle of the first Cold War reflected sort of the economic victory of a very strong U.S. economy over a smaller and collapsing Soviet economy. China's got problems, and we can talk about that if you want. I've written about it recently, but they're a much, much larger economy. By some measures, they're actually on a par, if not slightly greater than the U.S., but the conventional wisdom is that they're on a path of convergence that will equal the U.S. in dollar terms at some point in the next decade. And they're enormously powerful in terms of their weapons technology, as the Soviet Union was back then, but they're larger, stronger, and a far more formidable adversary against a United States that lacks that, at least to the extent that we had it in the first Cold War. So I think it's, a little bit worrisome, smug, potentially arrogant that we presume that just because we won the first Cold War, that the verdict will be the same this time around.
I guess I'm kind of an economics nerd, so there's a number of questions that came up in the book that probably take us a little bit off piste, but I'll indulge myself. One of them is, I think it's related to the kind of savings problem you talk about, and also the winnable Cold War false narrative that, in the first Cold War, the U.S., for a lot of that period, the federal government was investing heavily in basic research and development. And that just kind of gradually went down over time to the point where, it had fallen to, I think you said 25% of federal funding for R&D, where it had been over 70%. And it continued to decline. And what's interesting is that decline in U.S. kind of federal support for basic R&D coincided with the fall in the savings rate. And, I suspect there's some relationship there, but what I'm interested in is your opinion in some of the new policies that Biden administration has introduced, which seem to be moving, in the kind of back in the kind of older direction of getting the U.S. government more involved in basic research. I don't know if you agree with that assessment, if you think that's a positive step that might do something over the longer term to address the savings deficit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Kevin. And some of the developments that you're alluding to, of course, have occurred after the book was written, and in fact, published, especially the recent enactment of the Chips and Sciences Act of late last year, which seems to be what you are alluding to. I write about the technology piece because it's become so critical to America's anti-China narratives right now, especially the full throttled attack on Huawei, China's leading technology company, and the one that we've targeted as, a threat to national security through the alleged potential to install 5G infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure in the United States with a, quote, backdoor, unquote, that could unleash sort of Chinese espionage activities into our domestic society and defense. I make the admittedly controversial point that, our fear of Huawei, it could well be a false narrative in the sense that it deflects our focus away from the question you just raised on our own ability to invest in the building blocks of technological prowess through research and development, especially the basic research piece of R&D, as well as our failure to really invest in STEM-based higher education, science, technology, engineering, and math. The basic research piece of R&D really grew dramatically post the so-called Sputnik crisis and was critical in building our technological prowess, in sending men to the moon that we're now trying to do again. And then it has receded sharply in recent years. Whether or not it's a direct outgrowth of the savings shortfall, it's hard to pin that down, but I think that there's more than just coincidence behind those two similar trends. The Biden administration, to its credit, is focused on addressing some of these technology issues. And on the surface, the industrial policy actions that were taken last year, the CHIPS and Science Act being one, the Inflation Reduction Act being another, are aimed at addressing that shortfall. But, if you look under the hood of the CHIPS and Sciences Act, especially the $52 billion piece that is aimed at supporting the revival of the domestic semiconductor industry, the numbers show that about 81% of that total of $52 billion goes to bricks and mortar construction of new domestic fabs, as they're called, and only 19% goes to R&D. So, whether or not we really come to grips with this profound shortfall of the basic scientific research that goes into future R&D is still an open question. That worries me. And our fixation on Huawei as the enemy may well be a cover-up for our unwillingness to really do the heavy lifting on R&D that we really need to maintain our leadership technologically.
It was interesting. I had Chris Miller on the show, who wrote Chip War about the semiconductor industry, and he talks about various companies and whether or not they were involved in kind of IP stealing or forced IP transfer, and he says that there are some very clear cases of that, but ironically, Huawei was sort of the company that, in a lot of ways, did things that, I don't know if the right way, but they invested heavily in R&D. They invested heavily, with kind of U.S. expertise in management practices. They did a lot to become a very efficient producer and move up the value chain. And whether or not that it makes sense to have them embedded in our telecoms infrastructure is an open question. But he said it's a little bit ironic that they're kind of one company that kind of followed a similar path to say what some of the Korean and Japanese firms had done as they developed.
The footnote to that point, which I agree with, is that where is the U.S. on 5G infrastructure? There's not one domestic telecom company that has a meaningful market share that can provide us with the telecom infrastructure that we need to upgrade our own system. I mean, there are alternatives apart from Huawei, but they're Nokia and Ericsson. They're not U.S. domiciled companies. We have dropped the edge in really being able to maintain our presence in these critical telecommunication platform industries.
Okay, well, let's. So we've got in the U.S. we've got the false narratives of this kind of bilateral blunder or bluster, either one, both of them. And then also, this notion that, well, a Cold War is winnable. And as you point out, that might not be correct. It's highly unlikely to be to play out the way it did before. But China also has their own false narrative. So let's talk about that so we can kind of understand a little bit better how we got to this point of conflict. One thing that kept popping into my mind, and you're very explicit about this in the book, is can a country like China come to terms with false narratives, given that it's a kind of a society that's increasingly driven by mistrust? Can a surveillance state ever admit that there's false narratives? So maybe if you could start with that kind of high level question, then we'll talk about some of the specific false narratives that you think China is engaged in.
Yeah, I definitely feel that this is not just an inclination on the U.S. side, but one that's equally shared by the Chinese side. And I start my Chinese portion of the false narratives in the book off with a chapter on censorship, and make the point that in a system where the state controls the story and the dissemination of information and curates the facts that are available to the people, as well as to companies and other decision makers, that truth can be an especially elusive construct if it's sort of imposed from a propaganda ministry. And so that's a critical issue in preventing the internal discourse of a heavily censored Chinese society from facing up to misstatements and false narratives. I make a related point in that same chapter, and I admit this is hugely controversial, and I've been accused of a false equivalency here, but I'll say it anyway, that the U.S. does not have a state-directed system of censorship, but we have polarized information distortion, where a large portion of our society believes in conspiracy theories put out by one political party or another that have very destructive impacts on the way in which our nation attempts to move forward. And look no further than the big lie of the 2020 presidential election, which is playing out real time today as we speak, where again, the state doesn't censor the debate, but the political polarization amplified by social media really has a comparable disturbing impact on masking the public from the truth. So both nations, China more so, I would say in this regard, really suffer heavily from the way in which they selectively utilize, filter, and distort information to prevent the key actors in both systems from facing up to the difference between a true and a false narrative.
Is that a point that you're able to talk with your contacts in China about, or is that just an area that you avoid?
I don't avoid it. I was just in China last week, and I will raise this not as an issue to threaten their core values, but just to point out that we're in the midst of this very worrisome conflict. And wouldn't it be better to be able to resolve the conflict if we could both speak more freely than we could about these issues? And in a heavily censored society, that's difficult for the Chinese to do. And, I don't get much pushback from that. I really don't, Kevin. I think they The Chinese take state-directed censorship as a given. They don't deny it, but they're in large part unwilling, at least in the official circles, of course, to challenge the narrative as it is defended and projected by the state propaganda department.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the specific false narratives. You start off talking about this, I guess, the rebalancing to a more consumer-led economy, and that's a story that's been out there for many, many years. The notion that China overinvests and it needs to and will be able to kind of gradually shift to a more consumer-based society, and that's quite important because that's the sort of flip side of the U.S. savings deficit is kind of a degree of excess savings in China. So if China had less excess savings, then there'd be potentially less pressure on the U.S. to run such a big deficit. And you say that's a false narrative because the policies aren't in place to allow Chinese consumers to save less, that there's a lot of precautionary savings going on that won't be reduced unless there's some meaningful change in kind of the structure of the provision of retirement and health insurance.
Yeah, I mean, that touches on my favorite false narrative, which is, again, playing in real time right now in the U.S.-China debate. And let me just, I'll get to this question, but let me just give you a brief preamble. About 3 weeks ago, at the National People's Congress in Beijing, Xi Jinping just came out sort of and said what he had been hinting at for years, and that is that the United States, and he named us as is the adversary of China because it is engaged in what he called all-around encirclement, containment, and suppression of Chinese development. And this is an example of a classic false narrative. Yes, the U.S. now has come clean in embracing a strategy of containment, but China's inability to sustain economic development because of its failure to put in place the policies to support consumer-led growth, that's its own problem. That has nothing to do with the United States. So this, to me, qualifies as a classic false narrative, one that's grounded in the facts of America's containment strategy, but then is projected cause and effect to drive an outcome in the Chinese economy that is very much an outgrowth of China's own inabilities to support the model. I participated last week in a big conference called the China Development Forum, which I participated in basically every year since 2001. And I spoke in several sessions, but the first, or maybe the second panel I spoke on was the need to stimulate domestic demand or consumer demand. And I pointed out when I was addressing the conference last week that of the 20 some odd China Development Forums I participated in, I think this is the 8th time I have presented in a panel called Stimulating Domestic Demand. So, they know they have to do it, but they just can't do it. And I pointed that out very clear to them, and there was some nervous laughter, from the Chinese audience. And the point I've made is very simple. They generate a lot of spendable labor income by creating jobs in an embryonic but growing services sector. They raise real wages a lot by encouraging migration from the countryside to the cities where wage rates are more than double what they are in rural areas. But the labor income is not spent because of this deep-rooted sense of financial insecurity that is traceable to the lack of a well-developed, well-funded social safety net, retirement, and healthcare. And that's particularly problematic for a rapidly aging Chinese society. So the income comes in and it goes to provide for safety net needs for the future and does not drive the consumer-led dynamic. I have said this literally for 15 years in China. And they all say, those are very important points. Thank you.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but that a communist country has a problem with providing a social safety net relative to the U.S., which is always considered to have quite a weak social safety net. It's interesting your point about containment. We had Susan Shirk on the show, and she was talking about her recent book, Overreach, and she said that historically China's greatest fear has been containment by the West, yet its policy actions, particularly she was pointing out the wolf warrior, aggressive foreign policy stance, has created exactly the situation it fears the most. I don't know if you agree with that perspective or not. Sounds like you have a similar mind.
Well, again, cause and effect is tricky here. I mean, certainly I take the point that containment is a big fear, especially given the historical context that Xi Jinping has stressed from, the onset of his leadership, sort of grounding Chinese aspirations in this sort of rejuvenation perspective, compensating for a century of humiliation that can be dated back to the first of the Opium Wars in the mid 19th century, where Western and foreign countries in particular invaded and occupied parts of China, and containment was, a legacy of that. That's only part of the story. I mean, China, it had some problems of its own with the internal decay of the late Qing dynasty that have less to do with external containment and more to do with internal instability. But that's an important but a detail at this point. But where does the containment come from this time? Is it one that the wolf warriors are exacerbating, or did it begin with the Obama pivot of a post Middle East geopolitical strategy of the U.S. that was designed to return to the Asian theater and address the threat, the concerns of a rising China. A pivot that featured as its first major initiative the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a very ambitious pan-regional trade accord that included all the major nations of Asia, with a notable and important exception of China. How much of a role did that play in eliciting the response of the wolf warriors? And it goes on and on. The so-called AUKUS submarine deal between Australia, the UK, and the United States, aimed at creating a counterweight to China's very powerful and now the largest naval force in the world. So, it's the wolf warriors have not made things any better. You're entirely right about that. But, the counter to that is that they are responding to containment pressures that are emanating from the United States. And, you talk to Chris Miller, the latest and very significant chapter comes from containment focused on advanced semiconductors, which goes to the heart of China's aspirations for indigenous innovation. So, this is a two-way phenomena that, again, sort of fits, I think, my structure of dueling false narratives.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and I certainly wouldn't want to oversimplify her quite detailed and nuanced view of the relationship. But I thought that was kind of a broadly speaking, an interesting point about in the end, their greatest fear is being realized. But you're right; it's a kind of a complex and interactive set of relationships. Let's move on to conflict resolution. Let's move on to the last couple chapters of your book where you talk about potential ways forward. You say that, look, any conflict resolution has to be goal-oriented. It has to start with rebuilding trust and ultimately move to codifying fair and sustainable enforceable rules. And you make a couple suggestions. One is a bilateral investment treaty between the two countries to kind of ideally create a framework for setting those rules. And then you also talk about creating what you call a permanent secretariat, which would replace kind of periodic meetings with kind of a permanent standing group of Chinese and American policymakers, but also academics, researchers, et cetera, to manage the relationship. So let's talk first about your notion of a bilateral investment treaty. What is a bilateral investment treaty? Why do you think that potentially, I know there's political reasons it might not be exercisable at the moment, but what do you think that's a potential starting point for repairing the relationship?
Well, can I just back up a second to make the point that my book tries to be balanced in assessing the U.S.-China conflict from a relationship perspective, contrary to what we read in this country, that America has a China problem, and contrary to what I heard last week in China, that China has an America problem. I believe strongly that we both collectively have a relationship problem where we've allowed this relationship to become destabilized and in desperate need of repair. So the framework of resolution that I end the book on, and I didn't want to end the book with just another warning of mounting conflict and the Cold War that could turn hot, but I wanted to really offer what I hope are some constructive suggestions on the off-ramps here. The framework of resolution has to be a relationship framework that both countries jointly endorse rather than one imposing it on the other, as a U.S. Congress seems inclined to want to do right now. So, trust is, obviously the most important thing. There's very little trust, so that certainly needs to be dealt with right off the bat. And, you can't just push a button and reestablish trust. Take little steps first, like reopening closed consulates in both countries, relaxing visa requirements, restarting foreign exchange, student foreign exchange programs, relaxing constraints on the operations of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and then big, much tougher issues like climate change, global health, and cyber. Assuming we can make a little bit of progress in the trust front, then we have to suck it up, I think, and go for these more codified, rules-based proposals like a bilateral investment treaty. A bilateral investment treaty, finally getting to the answer of your question, is a treaty that lowers investment barriers for multinationals who want to invest in both countries. It's inherently pro-growth by allowing capital to flow more freely across borders. China's been an active supporter of bilateral investment treaties, has over 100 of them in place right now, more so than any country in the world. The U.S. has also been very active in supporting a bilateral investment treaty. We have over 40 40 of them in place right now. We were 95% of the way done at the end of the Obama administration, and then Trump immediately took that, along with many other things, off the table. And what a bilateral investment treaty will do is it not only reduces investment barriers, which is inherently pro-growth, but it allows you to codify a lot of the structural issues that have come between the two countries and include them as side clauses or side issues in the formal agreement. And so this could cover things like forced technology transfer, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and labor practices, environmental practices, and the like. So it's a broad, potentially powerful framework, but it's and I would say also it is far preferable to addressing frictions, economic frictions between nations, than something like the Phase 1 trade accord that was agreed upon by the Trump administration as the principal strategy to reduce America's trade deficit. The Phase 1 trade accord completely failed. And as I said earlier, the U.S. trade deficit has gotten larger rather than smaller. And, that's an example of a zero-sum approach to addressing an economic adversary rather than a pro-growth bilateral investment treaty. The final leg of the stool, if you want to call it that, is the U.S.-China Secretariat, which is actually a proposal I am most excited about and one that I have not seen elsewhere. And it recognizes that we really have a dysfunctional way of communicating with China. Example being, we shoot a balloon down, our defense secretary tries to call his counterpart in Beijing and no one answers the phone. And, there's no one sitting around to say, what's going on here. And we trade insults back and forth. Or, with COVID, same type of thing. We want to fixate on blaming a lab leak rather than getting to the heart of what caused the disease and what needs to be done to address it and prevent pandemics in the future. So I argue for the establishment of an organization that is staffed largely, as you said, Kevin, by equal complements of Chinese and American, diplomats, researchers, and other experts, located in a neutral venue and one that operates full-time 24/7 with a broad remit to cover all aspects of the relationship, from economics and trade to innovation to state subsidies to climate, health, cyber, even human rights. And the Secretariat is empowered to produce collaborative policy white papers based on a mutually agreed upon common database, no alternative facts. It has a convening function to bring experts into the process when serious unexpected problems arise, like COVID. And finally, it has a compliance function that monitors existing and new agreements with a dispute resolution mechanism should the inevitable frictions arise. And so it's basically a proposal for a new architecture of engagement. Right now, the engagement takes place, sporadically. Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met last November in Bali, so there was a lot of staffing, a few weeks before that meeting. But then, the staff went back to their day jobs. I want continuity, permanence, and a far more robust framework of support to this critical relationship.
Yeah, I really liked that part of the book, and I agree. I haven't read it about it before. And it sort of feels like right now we're relying almost on a kind of informal secretariat. We have people like you, we have people like Susan Shirk, presumably others who have contacts that they've built up over their careers. And there's this kind of informal channel of dialogue, which it's better than nothing. But really what you're talking about is setting up an organization in a neutral site. I don't know if we're talking, I suppose it doesn't really matter where. It could be Switzerland. It could be somewhere that both parties agree on. It's permanent, it's staffed by people, and it's recognized by both countries as, hey, this is the place we go if we've got a conflict. But more than that, it's producing, regular, joint research on how to make the relationship better over time, recognizing that, it's an interdependency, as you say, that's going to be there for our lifetimes and probably beyond. Do you, when you talk about this idea with people in the U.S., with people in China, what's been the reception?
Well, it's mixed, to be honest with you. I did talk about it in considerable detail with a number of Chinese officials and academics in my recent trip to China, and there's some interest. They would tweak this or that, and want to make a few suggestions, but in large part, they recognize that the lack of engagement and the framework that underpins that engagement is a hugely disconcerting and potentially risky phenomenon. When I attempt to present it in the U.S., especially to our government, whether it's the Congress or the White House, basically there's no interest. I mean, the response is something like, "You got to be kidding! We are not interested in a bureaucracy. We know what the problem is, and we want the Chinese to be more responsive to our perspective." And so I'm really committed to raising this issue in the United States much more than has been the case thus far. I definitely feel that we play just as an important a role in China in leading to this dysfunctional relationship, and it's our obligation to really commit to a different approach to managing the relationship. And if you don't like the secretary, give me a better idea. I'm happy to listen to it.
Well, you say in the book that the goal is to say, hey, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and it basically deserves an organization that is commensurate with that. Let's elevate the relationship to the status it deserves, I think is what you say. So, I appreciate you writing the book and trying to be constructive at the end. And I hope you continue to use your contacts and influence to move it forward. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. Like I said, it's really an honor to have a chance to speak with you. And I wish you all the best, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to, express my point of view and just underscore the bottom line that you just alluded to. This is a relationship that is now at a dangerous fork in the road, and we can't afford to let it continue to deteriorate.
Well, thank you. It's an important message, and I'm glad we have a chance to get it out there. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Niels.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Kevin, for a really important conversation about a couple of topics that we are all faced with today, namely, one, the false narratives that we are all exposed to through this news-driven world that we live in, and of course also the most important geopolitical relationship that we see today, namely between US and China. I really enjoyed Stephen's hard-hitting analysis of the current conflict between the US and China and the dangers of these false narratives and the rhetoric that have led to a trade war, a tech war, and a new Cold War. He really does stress the importance of a more credible assessment of the risks both nations face. And I like his idea of a new roadmap to restore a mutual beneficial relationship built on a higher level of trust and better communication between the two countries through, say, a US-China secretariat, especially, of course, if it's located in my country of Switzerland. That is it for today. Make sure you go and follow Stephen's and Kevin's work, as well as getting a copy of their books, because as you can tell from today's conversation, some of these ideas and topics are not being discussed enough on mainstream media. From Kevin and me, thanks so much for listening. We look forward to being back with you on the next episode. And in the meantime, as usual, take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Thanks for listening to Top Traders Unplugged. If you feel you learned something of value from today's episode, the best way to stay updated is to go on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so that you'll be sure to get all the new episodes as they're released. We have some amazing guests lined up for you, and to ensure our show continues to grow, please leave us an honest rating and review in iTunes. It only takes a minute, and it's the best way to show us you love the podcast. We'll see you next time on Top Traders Unplugged.